It gives me great pleasure to introduce Reagan Fox as the 2024 ISAN Keynote speaker. Reagan is an award-winning teacher, researcher, professor of communication at California State University, Long Beach. He is a prolific scholar. He has published 29 articles and book chapters, one monograph, 7 poems, and 2 collections of poetry. In 2005, yes, 2005, he started the Fox and the City podcast. He has produced and performed in several solo shows, and he participated in the 12th season of CBS's Big Brother, an experience that served as the basis for his 2018 book, Inside Reality TV, producing race, gender, and sexuality on Big Brother. I came to Reagan's work methodologically. He offers brilliant lessons about personal narrative, textual analysis, and autoethnography, and ways to work with different representational forms and media, podcasting, performance, poetry. He has written a lot about being vulnerable, rigorous, and dirty with our tales, working with elusive memories and emotions, and using and fusing artifacts and personal experience, what he terms autoarchaeology. I also come to Reagan's work topically. His work has allowed me to come to terms with claiming and proclaiming my queerness, realizing how friends and families can fail gay youth, and that I too survived with some good luck a turbulent childhood. Reagan, because of you, I'm less scared to revisit dreaded moments from my past. You also teach me to be accountable for my past bad acts, even if I may have been too young and naive to realize what I did. And simultaneously, you teach me to not be so hard on myself. Reagan, you're brilliant, and I hope you keep continuing to do the work that you do. And I'm grateful that you're here with us now. Please help me welcome Reagan Fox.
I need to start with a disclaimer. And I don't want to brag, but I suffer from abnormal anxiety. And one of its manifestations is a wee bit of agoraphobia, which makes attending an in-person conference not ideal for me because I get overly stimulated in large crowds of people. So when I do attend an in-person conference, I tend to go and present my research, and then I have a few things that I want to see and support, but I really spend most of my time in my hotel room with my heterosexual conference husband, Kurt Lindemann. This is all a long-winded rationalization for an embarrassing confession. After decades of attending conferences, I have never sat through a keynote address. So you can imagine my horror when Tony reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to deliver one for you today. I wanted to say no with every fiber of my being, but as many of you know, Tony is an angel from the heavens, and I can't say no to him. So I want to temper your expectations. Because I've never seen a keynote address, I see this going in one of two directions. Either it'll be really creative and outside of the box because I don't know what rules I'm breaking, or it'll be a complete disaster. Now, I don't want it to be a complete disaster, so I reached out to my good buddy and the smartest person that I know, Craig Gingrich Philbrook, who is a professor at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. And we got on Zoom a few months ago, and I said, Craig, help me. I'm at that age where I find myself to be the least interesting person in the room, which is why I wanted to vomit when Tony was talking about me. I was like, what? Who are you talking about? What am I going to talk about for an extended period of time? And Craig talked me off the ledge. And as luck would have it, he had been reading a book about visual art. And he started talking about the formal elements of art, things like shape and color and lines and the use of space and texture and light. And he pointed out that artists develop unique ways of combining those elements, maybe like a distinctive way of combining shape and color, and that becomes their signature. At first, I didn't understand his point, but then we segued into a conversation about some of the defining characteristics of my work, and a light bulb went off. I got it. You see, like visual artists, people who engage in poetic inquiry and autoethnography all pull from the same basic formal elements, but anybody who's been doing it for an extended period of time finds their unique ways of combining the elements, and that becomes their signature. So I would like to spend my time with you today talking about some of my unique stamps that I've put on autoethnography. And I call this a white elephant because, like the Christmas gift exchange, I'm going to talk about these elements as gifts. Gifts that were given to me by people who came before me and are much smarter than I am, that I have put my unique spin on, and I am regifting and giving to you. Now, I was a forensics competitor. I did speech competitions in high school and in college, so I know that any proper speech needs to have a preview of your main points. So here are the 4 gifts that I'm going to give to you. The first gift is shattered temporality. The second gift is embarrassment. The third gift is something I call oh-so. And the final gift is the gift of flow. So let's start with the first gift, which is shattered temporality. This is a gift that was given to me by Clifford Geertz. The first time I read Geertz, it was his essay, Notes on a Balinese Cockfight. And I remember being gobsmacked by how he expertly uses cockfighting to metaphorically explicate social and economic class in Balinese culture. I mean, it really blew me away, even to this day. Every time I read it, I'm like, wow. But the thing that stuck with me the most about Geertz is this temporal distinction he makes between being here and being there. And for Geertz, of course, being there is being back at the research site. You're in the field. It's the embodied experience of being at the cockfight, and your hands are clammy when you place a bet, and the police descend on the scene, so your fight or flight kicks in, versus being here, which is more often than not in the privacy and comfort of your own home or at your office, and you have some temporal distance from the event, so you have the benefit of retroactive sense making to intellectualize what happened back then. And this temporal distinction came in handy for me the first time I wrote an autoethnography, and that piece is called Skinny Bones. And in Skinny Bones, I offer a first-person account of the first HIV test that I took after going a decade without testing. And this wasn't just any decade, it was the most promiscuous decade of my life, from 18 years old to 28. And by the time I started writing a bulk of the analysis, I already knew what my result was. But the thing is that I realized that the most heuristically provocative part of what I would be talking about was that 2-week period. I had to sit with the ambiguity of my body and my blood, because this was back in the day where if you took an at-home test, you mailed off your blood sample, and then you had to wait 2 agonizing weeks to find out your results. So being here and being there became a really convenient way for me to structure my research report so that I could talk about that embodied experience of waiting for the result, not knowing what my HIV status was. And it was so effective that for the next 2 decades, that's the primary way I've organized my research: being here, sequences, and being there. But recently, I mean, very recently, being here and being there has shifted from this way of organizing research to a phenomenological binary. My post-structural impulses increasingly demand that I deconstruct. And I need to have like I don't know if confession is the right word, but I need to share something with you that's pretty traumatic in order to get my point across. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse. And the reason why I bring this up right now is because my experience having sex in the here and now is likely not the same as what it is for other people who have not survived sexual assault. And the reason why is because every time I have sex, my mind always drifts back to being back there in the throes of sexual abuse when I was 6 years old. And normally I hate it when I go to a conference and somebody reads directly off of a sheet of paper. But I want to do that, just one paragraph, because I've been working on a research project over the last year where I used my standpoint as a child molestation survivor. And by the way, I use the term standpoint here deliberately because, and this is a big aha moment for me, child molestation is not simply something that has happened to me. It has colored my perception of the world, the way that I process information in my day-to-day life. And at any rate, I use that standpoint to critique motifs of incest and abuse that are common in gay pornography. So I just want to read one paragraph. I promise I won't drone on and on about it, but I think it really beautifully encapsulates what I'm talking about. And it's a little dirty, so I apologize for that. Okay, so I say, being there, 2001. I'm in my first long-term relationship with a man. At 25, sex under the influence is the only intimacy I know. Child sexual abuse makes it difficult for me to see sex as love. Sex is tangled in past sexual abuse. Alcohol, cocaine, poppers, and MDMA make it easier for me to disassociate from sex's being here, which for me will always be tangled in being there in the throes of child molestation. One night we're high on cocaine when I ask if we can watch a porno as we have sex. He excitedly agrees. I cue up one of my favorite moments. The scene is an instrument that allows me to further remove myself from being here. To get off, I picture my lover as somebody who is only interested in me as a vessel or fleshy sex toy. My eyes shut. That's when the nastiest corners of my imagination pull at my mind. Stay present. Be here, I say to myself. But wraith-like limbs pull me back in time, past my partner's broad back, past an assortment of old boyfriends, past one-night stands who could have just as easily killed me as they did fuck me, past the queer bar bouncer who raped me, past my first kiss as a gay man. Ghoulish claws release me in a sexual wasteland that sits between multiple acts of child molestation and sexual latency I experienced until I turned 18. My body quivers as my boyfriend thrusts his pelvis against mine, but my mind is trapped in the past. Tick tock. Make it stop. When will the sex end? Tick tock. Tick tock. Meditating on a meathead bully from high school is the fastest way to make me come. Despite my commitment to reworking sex into the expression of love it should be, deeply routinized and unhealthy misapprehensions of intimacy disconnect my brain from my body when we make love. And so I really like this anecdote and the work that I'm doing here because if you've been practicing a certain sequencing for 2 decades, it starts to feel like home to you. But it's only through this sense of shattered temporality that I'm starting to realize that deconstructing that temporal binary is so productive for me. It's really shaping my perception of autobiography and poetic inquiry in important ways. And it kind of reminds me of when I was first submitting autoethnography to journals. And I had this bifurcation between my narrative voice, which was very poetic, and my method section in literature review, which was a lot drier and more of a traditional academic voice. And I was very fortunate to have reviewers who challenged me on that, who were like, no, you need to find creative ways to package your discussion of methods and creative ways to package your literature review and break down the wall that you have between those two sections. So it's nice to see this same sense of breaking down those walls happening with time as well. Okay, the second gift I'm going to give to you is the gift of embarrassment, which was given by two people who are in the audience today, and that's Carolyn Ellis and Art Bachner, although they probably didn't even realize they gave me the gift, but here we go. So the first time I read Ellis and Bachner, I was in Sarah Tracy's graduate seminar for qualitative research, and I'll be talking about her in just a moment as well. But the piece that we read is their chapter in the Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research. And it's this extensive explanation of autoethnography. I mean, I have never seen a chapter with more entries in its works cited than this piece. But I'll tell you what, there's one moment in this essay that I have kept with me as a touchstone, and I use it as a measure of if I'm going down the right path with every single essay that I write, and that's not hyperbole. And it's this moment early on in the essay where they warn potential autoethnographers that if you use this method, you need to be willing to paint yourself in a less than flattering light, to share things about yourself that may be embarrassing, things that you thought you would never share with anybody. And that sentiment really spoke to me, especially at the time, because I had just finished this 10-year stint as a slam poet or a performance poet. And the type of poems that do well in poetry slam tend to be written in the first person, they're autobiographical, and they are some sort of account of marginalization that the performer has dealt with, whether it's systemic injustice or interpersonal. And I don't want to diminish that work. Obviously, I love it, and I think that there's an important place for it, and it continues to influence the way that I write today. But you can imagine, after 10 years of being in that scene, I grew so tired of performance poets who had this like self-anointed martyrdom where they were constantly pointing the finger at all of these people who had done them wrong and all these institutions that had failed them. Because to me, one of the most interesting things that you can do from an autobiographical perspective is turn the finger at yourself and illustrate moments of mea culpa and dig into that. And I'll give you an example from Poetry Slam to illustrate my point. So my first signature piece in Poetry Slam is this piece called Heterophobia. And heterophobia is an account of familial homophobia, specifically my relationship with my father, Len. I came out of the closet when I was 18 years old. And after I came out of the closet, right after high school graduation, my father found really creative ways to assert his homophobia. So every time I came home from college, he'd ask if I had met any nice women, like every time, despite the fact that I had come out to him repeatedly. And so at the beginning of Heterophobia, I start that poem off and I say, each year my 80-year-old pops ponders why I've chosen to be gay. He'll ask if I've ever slept with a woman. I say no. And then, as if he's figured out the great conundrum of the century, he'll exclaim, well, then how can you really know? To which I reply, Dad, have you ever had sex with a guy? And I mean, it's a cute moment, but it doesn't really tell the full story. Because I was a late in life child for my dad. He was 56 years old when I was born, although he told me that he was 50 for the first 10 years of my life, and I never questioned it. He was just kind of like 50 in perpetuity, right? But something else happened right around the time I came out of the closet, and it's that my father began to show subtle signs of memory loss. And within 10 years, he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And then I graduated in 1994. He ended up passing away from Alzheimer's disease in 2004, so just 10 years. And after he passed, I immersed myself in literature about Alzheimer's disease. And one of the things that I learned was that a common symptom of Alzheimer's disease is the repetition of certain questions. And so I would go and perform poetry at different venues, and sometimes people would ask to hear heterophobia, but it didn't feel right performing it. It felt disingenuous because I was able to look back at that time period through a different light and through a different lens. And certainly, homophobia was a component to what was happening. But what really knocked the wind out of me was the way that I centered myself when my father had Alzheimer's disease. Like, I couldn't extend the grace for him that he needed. And everything he said, I had just such a negative interpretation of. And I know a lot of gay men have complicated relationships with their fathers, but my father was a really great man. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the richer story there is not how my father repeating this question demonstrated his homophobia. Really, the more complicated story happens when I do, as Ellis and Bachner say, and paint myself in a less than flattering light, and I use autobiographical instrumentation to turn inward. And I have to say that I do get worried when I look at some people in my discipline, communication studies, who use autoethnography from a critical perspective, and they're really good at pointing the finger at people who have done them wrong or institutions who have done them wrong, but who strangely never radically implicate themselves in their research. They're never the villain at any moment. And worse is when this contingency of scholars, and I'm not going to name names because I'm a good Christian woman, but when they confuse radical self-reflexivity for cultural reflexivity, it drives me up the wall because they're not the same thing. Cultural reflexivity is that ability to point out systemic injustice. Radical self-reflexivity is when you do what Ellis and Bachner say, and that is to go inward, to share things about yourself that are embarrassing. So my hope for the future is that reviewers will hold people accountable when they claim reflexivity, self-reflexivity in their work. Okay, woo, I got more emotional there than I thought. Okay, the third gift that I'm going to give you is, I call OSO, which is an acronym for objective self-observation. And what this means is the ability to look at yourself and your story through a lens of objectivity, which may seem like a contradiction in terms, given that most people associate autoethnography with a highly subjective orientation. But a unique opportunity emerges whenever we place our narrative in front of a backdrop of peer-reviewed research, because we're able to challenge some of the problematic narratives about ourselves that we've internalized as true. And so to illustrate this point, I'm going to borrow from that second gift, and I'm going to share something with you that is really embarrassing. something that, especially when I was younger, and a teenager, I never thought I would share with a group of people. And it's that when I was younger, roughly from the ages of 8 to 10, I peed on the floor, and sometimes even went number two on the floor. And this enraged my dad because we had just moved into this brand new suburban house, and we had this gorgeous baby blue carpet, gorgeous then at least. And my urine would bleach portions of the carpet and transform it into this like spongy and sticky neon green. Well, luckily, I outgrew that phase, but then I quickly pivoted into more self-destructive habits. So when I turned 11, I started smoking and developed a nicotine addiction that stayed with me until I was 30 years old. When I was 12, I experimented with drugs and alcohol and nearly failed out of the 6th grade. So my parents were up in arms. They didn't know what to do with me. And the summer going into 7th grade, they had me admitted into a behavioral hospital for a few months. And let me tell you something, that place scared me straight, so to speak. By the time I got out, I was on honor roll in 7th grade. I was like, I'm not going back to that place. And then when I got into high school, I was a really consistently good student, and I participated in all of these extracurricular activities. I was even nominated homecoming king as somebody like so obviously gay in Texas. I mean, that was a really big deal. But as you can imagine, I was always terrified to invite my friends from school over to the house because I was so scared that they were going to ask questions about the carpet. That carpet was like my scarlet letter or my urine colored letter. It was the proof of the truth of every hushed tone that adults in my family used to talk about me, and how I was, as my dad said, one of God's delicate children. And I just believed that I was just this internally flawed kid. It was just baked into my DNA. And that carpet was there. They never got it replaced. Every time I went home, it was just waiting for me. It was there when I graduated high school in 1994. It was there when my father passed away in 2004. So when we were like sitting Shiva, we're doing it around that carpet. That carpet was there when they sold the house in 2006. And so when I got into my 40s, I decided to start doing some peer-reviewed research about child molestation. And what the outside research told me was one of the most common symptoms of child sexual abuse is enuresis, which is this fancy term for peeing on the floor. And that realization really did a number on me. It brought me to my knees literally, and I just started bawling when I learned about it. Because it was the first time in my adult life that I realized that that pee on the carpet was not a reflection of my brokenness or some type of internal default. And I had really interiorized that. I looked at my past self with such disgust, and I was just grossed out by the kid that I was. And the part that really messed me up was this is symptomatic of child molestation. And I had interiorized symptoms of child molestation was something that was an internal default, something that proved how broken I was. But there was also something very uh, freeing about that as well. And so I have to chuckle when some critics of autoethnography kind of reductively treat it as just kind of like therapeutic for people who use the method and reporting style. And they often will say it's the auto part of autoethnography, like it's just top cure therapy, when strangely enough, it's not the auto part for me that I find all that therapeutic. It really has been anchoring my story to peer-reviewed research that has been the therapeutic part for me. Okay, my fourth and final gift. Oh, it's like half Hanukkah for gifts. I just realized that. Okay, so my last gift, the previous three gifts dealt more with kind of like the content level of writing. This one deals more with process, and it is the gift of flow. And flow is that magical space in our writing where we lose all track of time. And we know to appreciate flow by its antithesis, which is writer's block. You know, we're sitting down in front of our computer, every sentence feels like pulling teeth. And wouldn't it be great if there was some magic pill that we could take in order to access our flow when we needed it? And of course, it doesn't exist, but there are techniques. Some are more effective than others. But I've been practicing a technique over the last year that has radically improved my productivity. And I'll quantify that for you in just a moment. But in order to get to this technique, I need to first, because it's a variation of a technique you've probably all heard before. So we need to go through kind of like the more standard technique that you've heard before we get to the innovation. Okay, so the one that you've probably all heard before is write an hour a day. As a doctoral student, I remember Bud Goodall poking his head in my office and telling a group of graduate students that we need to write 1 hour a day at least. And this isn't bad advice. In fact, it came in really handy for me when I wrote my last academic book. It works well if you have concrete deadlines to work with, right? Like I need to finish chapter 1 or, you know, whatever the case may be. And so it took me about a year to write my last book. And I was hoping that after a year of doing this, it would become habituated into my daily routine. But a magical thing happened. After I submitted the book, I thought, okay, it's my time to write an hour today. And it was no longer an hour, it was no longer like freeing me up to write an hour. Suddenly that became a mental roadblock. I was like, free writing for an hour? This is horrible. What am I going to do? It just didn't work for me. And the hardest part of writing for me is always just sitting down to write. It's starting. And I compare it to jumping into a cold pool. Nobody is a bigger baby about jumping into a cold pool than I am, right? Okay, so now we're going to get to the variation of the rule. So one of my favorite people on the planet is Sarah Tracy. Sarah Tracy, by the way, is the best teacher that I have ever had. She's an expert researcher, and she's recently pivoted into an administrative role. And she's currently the director of the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication at Arizona State University. And when she made that change, she was looking for advice on how to tackle those tasks that always worm their way to the bottom of our pile. You know, think about the emails where you think, okay, I'm just not in the mood to get to that. I'll do it later. And then days go by, weeks, months, sometimes years, right? And then when you finally get around to doing it, you think, oh my gosh, this is like a 2-minute task. Why did I let it take up so much space in my brain and my email box when it would have been so easy, right? Okay, so Sarah shared this hack that she read about online, and it's spend 15 minutes each day tackling those tasks that you would normally put off. And I read that and I was like, wow, that's so simple. Sarah Tracy, you are a constant source of inspiration. And then I thought about it more and I was like, oh, hold on. The hardest part for me about writing is jumping into the pool. What if I applied this to my writing instead of like tasks like email? Because here's the thing, even if I'm not feeling creatively inspired, I can always sit down and spend 15 minutes writing something. I'll work on a works cited. I will beef up citations. I'll work on grammar, or kind of like my Sisyphus task is I'm constantly changing things from APA to MLA to Chicago because one journal doesn't want the piece and I have to submit it somewhere else. And what I have found is that when I know that I can stop after 15 minutes, it suddenly frees me up. It's a different ball game than if I start doing something and think, oh, I have 50 more minutes to go. If I know I only have 5 more minutes to go, it's a psychological thing. And 95% of the time, that 15 minutes has turned into an hour or 2 hours for me. And I want to give you this in super concrete terms. I've done the math, and over the last 2 decades, on average, I've produced 2 peer-reviewed essays a year. Since I've started using this technique, I, in the last year, have penned 5 essays that I've submitted to peer-reviewed journals. 3 of them have been accepted for publication or are already published. 2 of them are currently in review. I wrote 4 book chapters, and I completed 1 invited essay. And so I'm fully aware that different techniques will work differently for different people. But if you try this out, and after a few months, it works for you and does magic for you like it's done for me, please reach out to me either on social media or email me and let me know, because I really, if it works for other people, I want to pass this around like it's gospel. Okay, so those are my 4 gifts. And I want to end with a proper conclusion and something a bit uplifting. At least uplifting for me. So 8 years ago, I turned 40 and I decided to go seek therapy. And when I went into Kaiser Permanente, which strangely enough is, this is actually really funny. I wasn't going to say this, but why not? It's right next, because I live in West Hollywood. My Kaiser Psychiatry is directly next door to the big blue Scientology building. So as I'm walking into psychiatry, there are Scientologists trying to like hand me pamphlets, and they are notoriously anti-psychiatry. So I go in and I talk to Monica, my therapist, and she says, well, why are you here? And I say, okay, well, I'm ready as I enter middle age to let go of some of the traumas that have defined the previous chapters of my life. I want to start afresh. And she said, trauma? What kind of trauma? So we focus specifically on child molestation because that is the formative trauma of my life. And she asked me how I view myself at 6. And that's how old I was when I was sexually abused. And like I said earlier, I'd always looked at that kid through the eyes of other adults or siblings in my family who were always, because I was the baby of the family, always disgusted by my quote unquote attention-seeking behavior. In fact, when I came out of the abuse closet to my parents, they assumed it was just attention-seeking behavior. So I said, I look at that kid as messed up and behavioral issues and dirty, didn't take a lot of baths. And honestly, I look at the kid with disgust. And Monica recommended this activity. She said, when you get home, I want you to find a picture of yourself when you were 6 years old. And I want you to just sit with that picture of yourself and stare at it for a really long time. It's a mindfulness activity. And then when you feel ready, I want you to talk to your, ooh, sorry. I want you to talk to your 6-year-old self. And this exercise spoke to me because I watch RuPaul's Drag Race, and RuPaul has her drag queens who make it to the finals do something very similar. It'll be like, Chi Chi Fontaine, here's a picture of yourself at 10. What do you have to say to this picture of yourself? So I kind of knew I was prepared for this. So I got home, and I'm going to share my screen so you can see. Oh, I'm going to get emotional. I'm sorry. Can y'all see my picture? Okay. So out of all the pictures that I found, this is the picture I went with. And it's this shadow box portrait that was done at my school. And I thought, oh, wow, this is a like perfect picture because it's like a shadow of myself at 6, like the shadow that I retreated into after I was abused. And I sat there with it. And I really focused a lot on like the little nose and the little lips and the little eyelashes. And it was the first time that I was able to look at my 6-year-old self with compassion and love. And I just wanted to protect that kid and hug him. And I never felt that way ever before about the 6-year-old version of myself. And it was like, it gave myself permission to pull that kid out of the shadows and see him as a colorful, vibrant kid who deserved to be protected and whose behavioral problems that would happen in the wake of that shadow portrait, that wasn't a part of him, that's something that happened to him. And the other big realization, and this is what I'll leave you with, is that trauma isn't something that you close the door on, which was what I was hoping with when I started therapy, because that's just like the wrong orientation to have with it. It's not about letting go of trauma, it's about honoring survival. And the way that I do that is through my writing. And incidentally, my father, who I talked about before, was a writer. That was his trade. And so writing is a gift that my father gave me. And I'm really proud of what I've done with my writing. And I think my dad would be too. And that's all I got. Woo! I'll tell you, you rehearse something a lot and you can anticipate where the emotion might come in. But until you really do it, I think for an audience, some of those realizations I've had are so recent for me. Yeah. Okay, I'm composed.
Reagan, you're getting a lot of good love in the chat. So thank you. Desiree.
Hi, sorry, it takes me a while to turn my my mic on and stuff. I'm just struggling with this. I just want to say thank you so much for your really, really beautiful work. And I don't know, you know, I don't exactly know how to say this, but you're not alone. And I am a childhood sexual abuse survivor. I was abused by my father when I was like 6 months old, until I was around 4. And I'm an autoethnographer, and it's something I've never, ever, ever written about. And so I just want to say, like, I don't even know how to say it, but like the way that you spoke about like the honesty with which you spoke about the situation, I think is going to have like it's reverberating with me in a really big way, especially because of, it's this, like I've been an autoethnographer for a long time, and I have an important relationship with that kind of work, and so I don't really know what to say besides for thank you. And that, like I'm 60 now. I dealt with my memories when I was 28, 29, 30. And I also had to deal, my mother committed suicide when I was like 32. So it was a really hard time for me. And that process of like love, the process of self-love, that process of self-love and loving the small parts of myself is so ongoing. And it is one of the most important things that I do. You know what I'm saying? And so that's all I wanted to say, and say thank you for your honesty and bringing this up, and just thank you for being you and the loveliness of who you are. I mean, I've never met you before, but you really are incredibly lovely. And so thank you for that as well. Thank you. And I'm done. Thank you.
Keith?
Where's your screen? Girl. Girl. That was to me brilliantly and painfully stunning. It was stunning. On a lighter note, you have a way, I've known you long enough, you have a way of setting up a presentation that makes you wonder, okay, where's Reagan going to go with it, right? He's nervous, he's setting it up, and you fucking knock it out of the park every time. And I'll leave the sports metaphors with that one, right? But and I mean that as a compliment, and and I love that about you. I love that about you. I didn't know some of these things. I've read your work since the beginning, read with you, grown with you. I'm 52, you're 48, but we're that same gay age. And there's not enough work done on our age and aging. And that particular, I'll be in that particular time of waiting 2 weeks. I had to do that at the Illinois State University at the county health department. So I didn't do the male one. I took my ass in the country. So that same setup that's in Rocket Man when Elton John is at the health department, right? And the shame and the horror of that. My entry point is being an adult survivor of an addict. And so I could do a parallel tracing of some of this stuff here. I have that same picture, that shadow picture. And I have trouble looking at the screen for that, and I just thank you. I thank you, and we should talk, because I don't know anyone else that brings phenomenology to autoethnography and narrative, which is what I do too. I don't know anyone that does it better than you.
Oh, thank you. I do want to kind of respond to some of the things that you said, because it's so generative. I think precisely for the reason of being, Gen X gay autoethnographers. And the first thing that I wanted to say is in relation to the shadow box portrait. And, Generation X were like the first generation of latchkey kids. And one of the things that really strikes me whenever I see my friends, and I don't know if it's just that I have really amazing friends who are parents, but all of my friends who are parents are just like these amazing present parents in a way that escaped me and all of my friends. And I don't know if that's a generational response. I'm just not sure what it is. So I really feel you there. And the second thing that I want to say is that one of the things, something that's kind of on the periphery of a lot of my writing lately, as I go through my mid-age crisis stuff, is what it's like to be in this kind of limbo generation of gay men who were really coming of sexual age at a time where we weren't hit like the way the generation immediately before us was hit. But the fear of sex, the idea that your life trajectory was going to hit a brick wall of death at some point is still baked into our phenomenological encounters with the world. And prep doesn't matter. You know, you can't erase yourself from it. It's kind of like what I was talking about in the speech, where a piece of our perception is always going to be anchored to the height of the AIDS pandemic.
Stunning. I'll be in touch, my friend. But thank you.
Yeah.
You have other hands there. You have other hands.
Sally.
Oh, Reagan, wow. Do you know, you're on the program and you didn't put any blurb, and I thought, oh, why is he not putting any blurb? Why is that? They're not putting any blurb. That's very, I'm not going to that. And then obviously we had that little exchange, and I thought, oh, like you.
I'm so glad you stayed.
Yeah, I'm so glad I stayed. People here will know that I was very close to Kip Jones, and I worked for British Airways. I was a cabin crew, you know, air stewardess in the 80s, and we lost a lot of people to the AIDS epidemic, and I always remember Kip saying, you know, that era, they lost a whole, you know, wipeout. Don't even say that, wipeout. So, you know what Keith was just saying there, how could you not be impacted? But I just wanted to say to you today, your personal story, Art's put it in there, by God, demonstration of evocative autoethnography, but God, that's a brave thing to share, and not brave because you need to feel ashamed or anything like that, but when we share our stories and we share them in a group, and then there's something different happens when we do, and that was so evident for you today, and I was so fucking moved every step of the way. And I've written down, and I'm going to go and look up you. I don't even know you are, so I'm like, oh, now I'm looking up, and now all the students I teach are going to know. So I just want you to know that is absolutely the impact you've had on me. And I'm so glad that there was that little exchange, because I wasn't going to stay.
Yeah,
So,
you know, it's funny. I feel the same way about you. I'm really so delighted that you stayed. And I feel just with our brief exchange, like a kindredness with you. So
yeah,
this has been very fortuitous. Yeah.
much love. Look after yourself. You're doing great work, but look after yourself as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Art, are you waving? Are you waving, Art? You're on mute.
Okay. Yes, congratulations on a wonderful, wonderful keynote talk, whatever you want to call it. I had one. I know you were running out of time, and that may have been a part of it. But toward the very end, you made a distinction between what is a part of you and what is something that happened to you. And I understand the therapeutic context in which that might have been that distinction might have originated. But I wonder if you could talk a little more about it, because I guess I would want to push back a little bit and say the things that happen to you usually become a part of you, whether you want them to or not.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you asked about this, because that bit of the porn essay that I'm working on, this is going to be one of the ways that it's going to be a focus of my revision of it. So it is the realization that I've had while writing that piece that child molestation is not something simply that happened to me, but that child molestation is a standpoint and affects my phenomenological experience with the world. And so we're saying the same things, we're saying, but in a bit different way, right? I don't know that until I started writing this piece, which has been the impetus for me of challenging the being here, being there stuff, that I realized, oh my gosh, child molestation is a standpoint. Because traditionally, the way that people talk about standpoint, it may be like feminism or queer or
Right.
something along those lines. And to think about like, oh, like this trauma that has happened to me really shapes everything. I'll give another example of this, actually. So I often have students tell me that they see me on campus, and while I'm walking through campus, they try to say hi to me, and it's like I look right through them. And I say to them, and because we're friends on Facebook, like how much I love my students, my life revolves around my students. And so I'm always embarrassed when that happens, but I have to explain to them, like you have to understand that when I was in high school and middle school, the anti-gay bullying was so horrible to me that my gaze was always infused with this excessive sexuality. So if I looked back at somebody, that would incite anti-gay violence, like punches to the arm or to the chest. And so, that's another example of how anti-gay bullying is not just like something I survived, right? But it's also something that impacts my communication practices, the way that I perceive the world, the way that I move through the world. Yeah.
Well, good response. I like your response very much. And also, I don't know where you're going to send the things that you're working on now. But whether you call it standpoint or you call it framing or whatever else, it's deeply embedded in communication theory,
Yeah.
in real communication theory,
Yeah.
not what necessarily stands as communication theory in our discipline.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carolyn?
Oh, Reagan, that was incredible. Thank you so much. I don't have anything real smart to say. I just want to say that your piece touched me deeply, and I think it's really a model of how evocative autoethnography can be done. And I think Art said that in the chat as well. It was just beautifully evocative and insightful and vulnerable and probing and self-awareness and all those things that we hope a good autoethnography would be. So we are so appreciative of your being with us and giving this talk and sharing your life. And thank you. I know it's going to be very helpful to a lot of people who are asking all kinds of questions about being vulnerable and all of that kind of thing that you have demonstrated so well.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me into your fold. I've so much had such a great time getting to know you and Art. Yeah, it's been at a time before we started, I was talking about how I'm triggered by certain things happening in our discipline right now. And every interaction that I have with y'all just feels like a warm hug. And I feel a sense of being protected. and that's something that I don't always get when I go to NCA or a regional conference. So I really appreciate that.
Our pleasure.
Oh,
And your mug is perfect, by the way.
I agree. No, another thing that I wanted to say, and this just kind of circles back to that second gift about painting yourself in a less than flattering light, which I didn't get to. I mentioned how I really use that as a touchstone for me every single time I write. And so whenever I am figuring out what anecdotes belong in a piece, I know I'm on the right track when I think, am I painting myself in a less than flattering light? Am I sharing something that I'm embarrassed by? Or at one point, I never imagined that I would share with an audience of people. And so I really thank you for that gift that you've given me, because I think that has really been, more than anything else, what has allowed me to access vulnerability in my work.
Laurel wants to speak. Go ahead, Laurel. You have to unmute yourself, honey.
Wonderful, Reagan. I want to say that when we make ourselves vulnerable in our writing and make us less than we are, that makes our readers like us. I'd like you to respond to that.
Yeah,
We all loved you today.
I'm going to actually bridge this to one of the lessons that I've learned from being on reality television, right? Because there is something similar in autoethnography and the way that you manufacture yourself when you're on a reality television show, right? And one of the big gifts that I learned from being on reality TV, on my program, I was at war with this woman named Rachel, who had this really bright red hair. And we got into a big fight, and I'm never at a loss for words, so I just eviscerated her, right? And I was really at a period in my life where I held on to grudges. And I thought that vulnerability, because of all of those years of being bullied, I assumed that vulnerability would make me more vulnerable to abuse, right? And one of the things that I've noticed on reality shows is that you could have somebody who's a villain for several weeks on a reality show. Everybody turns against them and it becomes a mob mentality. And then suddenly the audience's sentiment shifts. They think, stop bullying this person, have compassion for them, even if they were kind of monstrous at the beginning. You need to let go of this, right? And so these are kind of some of the gifts that reality TV gave me. I was like, okay, number one, it's okay to express harm or feeling harmed in a way that's not aggressive and that is more vulnerable. And often when we do that, it may be counterintuitive for somebody who has survived abuse or assault. More often than not, it doesn't make you more vulnerable to attacks. I think when most humans get to a certain age and they've matured, it makes them want to take care of you, even if you've messed up in the past. And luckily for me, I don't know if I would have ever truly grasped that without seeing myself on national television, not extend the grace to my opponent. Yeah, that was a big learning lesson for me. And I think it's one that extends into it extends into autoethnography. And again, I want to just tie it back to the people who don't radically self-implicate. Those people who don't radically self-implicate in their autoethnography, but who claim they're practicing radical self-reflexivity, incidentally, are some of the people in the discipline who most trigger me, who I find most on the offensive, most like these are the people who in panels will make people cry and to call them out. And there is a certain lack of grace afforded to people. And you see it in their writing as well. And I have tried when appropriate, because it works in the other direction too. It's not just kind of like digging into the moments where I may be a villain or have a mea culpa, but also taking somebody who has been a villain in my life and writing about them in a way that humanizes them, to kind of like use Burkean language, like instead of a tragic frame, comic frame them, like that high school guidance counselor who was pretty awful to me, was part of a greater system in Texas that didn't acknowledge the existence of gay and lesbian youth by state mandate. Well, the trick therein is that if gay and lesbian students don't exist, anti-gay bullying can't exist. And so she is operating within that network. And so if I were to then, in my writing, exclusively focus on only these moments that she was mean to me, I'm really kind of missing the point.
Thank you.
And thank you for your work too. I also read a lot of your work in Sarah Tracy's seminar as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I always like to make people good. I've always loved writing about my husband, and I always making people love him. That's my favorite thing when I write when I wrote about him, make people really like him, even if I was mad at him. That's really fun.
Yeah, you know, one of the gifts, because I was talking about my father, was going back in a recent piece that kind of extends some of Carolyn's work, where the beginning anecdote is about that heterophobia poem, and retelling that story the way that I told it here, and being able, oh, I get a little weepy every time I talk about it, being able to honor what a wonderful dad I had and how great he was. And, you know, surely, like I said, certainly a little bit of homophobia was mixed into that, but the wonderfulness trumps all of the other stuff. I'm so fortunate that I've had the parents that I've had.
Anybody else?
Amazing.
I feel
Great,
happy despite all my tears. I feel very, very happy, and I want to let y'all know that.
Annabelle, do one more comment and then we'll.
Oh, I
Hi.
see Annabelle's hand up.
Hello, Australian accent here. In thinking about emotions and evocative autoethnography, which is something that I've always been inclined to, and I'd suggest that part of that is because I've always been a very openly emotional person, and it doesn't take much to make me cry. And I want that to be in my writing. But as an academic, and I don't I work in education, not specifically in research. And so hiding your feelings or hiding your responses, or that viscerality, that feeling that you get where tears are inappropriate because you're supposed to be fulfilling some sort of role, like you need to listen to me, I know what I'm talking about. That in an academic environment where the people who are able to get something across clearly without the emotions, certainly by students, the sort of students that I work with who are going to be teachers, they will value that above what I'm suggesting we should all learn to be able to do. So yeah, that idea that some of us are more openly, outwardly emotional than others, and in past experiences, how we might hold that back because it's not appropriate in our role as, Ragan, you're wearing a suit, shirt and tie, and tears are a bit, not the thing that a man in a shirt and tie does. And yeah, so that it's still a battle outside this sort of group of people who are interested, obviously, and in what we're talking about. How else does it fit into the academy?
Yeah,
So
that's
yeah,
no, I get what you're saying, and it's tough. One of my favorite classes to teach is a large lecture of rhetorical theory to undergraduates. And whenever I do my LGBTQ theory and history lecture, because I always feel compelled to have a historical component to that, given the erasure of LGBTQ history, some of it state mandated in the United States. And if they don't get it from me, where else are they going to get it, right? But when there are slides that I show when I'm talking about the AIDS pandemic, and there are a few of them that get me every time. And one of them is I'm showing the AIDS quilt, but I do it from various perspectives, like a close-up of the quilt so they can appreciate the artistry that goes into each quilt square. And then zooming out and zooming out and zooming out to where you have this huge overhead view of the AIDS quilt on the national lawn, and you see how huge it is. So that the enormity of that. And then there's an image, I'm sure a number of people who have seen it, where it's the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir, and some people are in black, like overwhelmingly people are dressed in black, and then a few people are dressed in white, and it's just like a few people. And the caption for it is like, the people in white represent the number of people who survived the AIDS pandemic, who were a part of the San Francisco Choir at the height of the pandemic. And that one, I have to you can't help but get emotional, because like Keith and I were saying, it's just so baked into the way you see the world. And sense making is not just like mind, but it's also emotion. But I do feel a need to protect my students from emotionality that may not totally translate with them. It's like listening to people who are generations before me talk about Pearl Harbor versus the way I talk about 9/11, right? And so it's a balancing act, right? Because we have our professional ethos, especially in front of a classroom. So, but I do try to give them a hint. I try to gypsy rose it, I give them, I won't go full nude with my nudity, but I'll show them a little shoulder of the emotion before I pull it back in.
That is great. That's great. And that's a great way to wind down this section. Reagan, it's been an honor. This is a life-changing presentation. I'll never forget this.
Oh, that's so
never.
nice. Thank you.
I'll live with this for forever. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This has been the most amazing conference experience probably I've ever had.
Same. Right back at you. Thank you, Reagan. Thank you for being with us.